Hello, and welcome to the Brave New Weed podcast. And now, here's your host, Joe Dolce.
Welcome to episode 73 of the Brave New Weed podcast, folks. These are high-minded conversations for the post-prohibition era. I'm your host, Joe Dolce. I'm here with Matthew Hendershot, our co-producer. Hi, Matt.
Good morning, Joe. Greetings from Germany. It was a long trip to get back here, but we're back in action. So
we're going to talk about how to mitigate some of that jet lag in a few minutes. But before we do that, I want to just tell everybody that this is an episode really about the future of cannabis and cannabinoids, because we've got Ben Chiarelli on, and I've been wanting to talk to Ben for months. He is the founder and CEO of a company called Cellibre, which they call a cellular agriculture company that is really ushering in the next industrial revolution by manufacturing cannabinoids industrially. I'm not going to tell you anything more about this other than it is highly controversial, highly interesting, and is absolutely going to turn this industry on its head once they get into production. So please listen to this episode. And I also want to tell you that this episode is brought to you by the 5th annual Summit 420, which is an incredible cannabis conference. I've been to it. I'm hosting this year's event. It's part of the Young Presidents Organization, and it's taking place in San Francisco, California on April 24 and 25. For the last 2 years, this has been awarded the best of the best business event within the entire international Young Presidents Organization network. So if you're a YPO member, or if you're a YPO member who's kind of curious, I really want to urge you to come to San Francisco and listen to what is going on this year. You're going to really hear about cutting-edge technologies. You're going to learn about incredible research happening, and you're really going to hear amazing speakers. As I've told you before, Ethan Nadelman, the former head of the Drug Policy Alliance, is the keynote this year. We've got people talking about how to include disadvantaged communities in their business plans, practical ways of doing this. This is not high-minded stuff. This is actual stuff. We have Mark Williams, the founder of Firefly Vaporizer. We have an amazing infused dinner by the Cannister series, one of the great cannabis chefs organizations in the Bay Area. We're going to take you on tours of tech startups like Meadow. We're going to show you how to make cannabis-infused marshmallows. It's just going to be an incredible experiential event. You're also going to meet some of the most successful business leaders in this new emerging market. So again, I want to encourage you guys, if you're YPO members, register for this event at www.ypo.org/Summit 420 2020. The space is limited. Don't delay. Bring your spouse, bring your partner, bring any other interested people. We're going to make some history together. Summit 420. So, Matt, have you? I've been looking at the news in cannabis lately, and it's been sort of quiet. What have you been looking at? What have you been seeing?
We try and keep our finger on the pulse, and a lot of stuff out there is just more par for the course. Some state or municipality has advanced a bill out of committee. People are talking. People are looking. There's a lot of moving parts, but it's kind of like a volcanic lava flow to where it's unstoppable.
What about the candidates in our presidential thing? What's happening there?
Which is where I was headed. We do see, especially from the Democrat side, and I think we all knew that this was coming, but the fact that legalization of cannabis is now a stump speech level platform talking point for anyone who's out there running for president in 2020. And as these things are increasing with frequency and intensity, we are starting to see a lot of chatter. Cutting to the front of that chatter is, of course, the 2016 underdog favorite, Mr. Bernie Sanders. Senator Sanders has gone out and pledged that on day one of his taking office, should he be elected president, that he will use the executive order to legalize marijuana in every state in the country.
Now, from my understanding, that's not really possible. I've always understood that in order to legalize and get this thing out of Schedule 1 is an act of Congress, not an executive order.
Well, you're right. Normally it would be because it was, placed under the Controlled Substances Act by an act of Congress. However, it does turn out that the executive branch does have the authority under the CSA to reclassify cannabis without any further action from Congress if they want to. The details of the process are a little bit sketchy, a little bit complicated. It requires approval from the Attorney General, and it would require approval from the Health and Human Services Secretary, and those are appointed positions from the president that he would have to have in place before he could actually do the executive order.
So that ain't happening. So it's not happening on day one. It might happen on day 91 or something, right?
Yeah, maybe it's a month in or something like that once these places get filled. But it is really interesting that it is something that is so vocal that Sanders is out there, including this in his stump speech, and he's not the only one. On the Democratic side,
I was going to ask, what are the other candidates saying? I mean, I should know this, but for some reason it's not top of mind, and it's certainly not in headlines. Are any other candidates out on this?
Well, almost everyone on the Democratic side has made a mention to the legalization process, but some of the more prominent statements include Indiana Mayor Pete Buttigieg,
Buttigieg. Say it again.
Pete Buttigieg.
You've been away too long, Matt.
Buttigieg. Yeah, well, they're all hard G's here in Germany. He has actually advocated to include the decriminalizing of possession of all drugs as part of racial justice balancing and mental health plans.
Here, I say.
Tulsi Gabbard has also mentioned that she supports legalizing and regulating currently illicit drugs. And some of the unfortunately, Andrew Yang has dropped out of the race by this point, but he and Tom Steyer were also big advocates for decriminalizing cannabis and opioids as part of harm reduction measures. So
smart moves, I say, smart moves.
So there's a lot of stuff out there definitely involving cannabis, but even outreaching the cannabis prohibition into other drugs that are currently prohibited in the United States that might have therapeutic or medical benefits. So it'll be an interesting thing to see play out.
Good. There's another thing I just want to tell our listeners, Matt. I was talking to the founders at Sunsoil CBD. Remember those guys?
Yeah, I do. We had some nice conversations here on the cast about that.
They grow amazing organic hemp, and they sell it for the best price of anywhere in the United States that I've ever found. And this month of February, they're offering 50% off of all of their products. That includes oil, soft gels, capsules, and topicals, okay? You can find this promo on their website. It's sunsoil.com. It's all organically farmed in Vermont. It's all full spectrum. It's all naturally extracted using coconut oil, and you can get all of their test results online. By the way, they are not paying us to advertise this. I just came across it because I was talking to Jacob Goldstein, one of the founders, the other day, and he told me about this. So I want to share that information with you, our listeners, because the product is great. It's already inexpensive, and now it's the most inexpensive you can get. It's only through February, this 50% promotion, and you can learn all about it at sunsoil.com.
Yeah, I think this is a really great opportunity for people who are looking to expand their usage of CBD or even get started experimenting in CBD at all. I think one of the things you see right now is CBD popping up absolutely everywhere. Even here in Germany, if I go into like a little quick stop or a gas station, you'll find CBD flower or weird gummies or anything like that. And it's just anybody can slap a label on the side of a product and say that it's going to be a CBD product and it's good for you or it's going to work. And sometimes that's can be true. Sometimes it's just absolute shill marketing garbage. And so I think
a lot of times there was a study that came out recently that said 70% of all CBD product is not what the label says it is.
Well, and there's so much
70%.
Yeah, right. There's so much like MLM, like multi-level marketing pyramid scheme stuff going on in the world of CBD, where it's like, oh, I sell these gummies and you can sell them too, and it's become like a new Avon type product where you sign people up to shill these things out. And so the point being, I'm glad to see a company with a positive and defendable reputation, the science to back up their product, doing something that would allow people to access their products in a way that can help them and not just be out to make a quick buck.
And I asked them, why are you doing this? And they said, because we want to give back to the people that have supported us. So good for them. I think it's great. But it also, it leads very naturally into what this episode is about, okay? Because one of the things that drives me crazy is the high price of CBD, right? These bottles are costing, for an ounce or two, somewhere between $60 and $100 often. Good quality product. I have no beef with people trying to make money and creating good product, but that is a lot of cash, okay? And it's sort of unsustainable for people who are using this stuff regularly. I think my leased car costs less per month than a regular dosage of CBD at $60 a bottle.
Joe and I will continue to publish every episode of the Brave New Weed podcast for free for you, our listeners. But we could always use your support. If you've got a little extra change rattling around in your pocket, you can cruise over to patreon.com/bravenewweed and become a supporter of the show. Everything that you'd pledge to support helps us to increase the guests that we can have on the show, even eventually the frequency of the show. And we have a great set of rewards out there, including copies of Joe's book, invites to special events that we will do in New York City, all sorts of fun things. So if you're enjoying the podcast and you would like to support us, visit patreon.com/bravenewweed today.
So that's why this is interesting. Ben Chiarelli founded this company called Cellibre a couple of years ago. They call themselves a cellular agriculture company, which really means what they're doing is producing cannabinoids industrially from things like yeast, algae, and other natural substances. Now, whether you call this natural or whether you call this highly unnatural is, I think you're going to have to come to that determination after you listen to this podcast, okay? Before you do, I want to tell you that Ben, he has worked with Craig Ventnor, who is a Nobel laureate. I think he invented the genome or figured out how to find the genome. We're going to learn about that. He's also worked in the pharma industry, and he's worked across lots of different categories. He is going to tell us things that a lot of you listeners are going to find objectionable or of deep concern. And I want to hear your response to this, okay? Because while it may sound very unnatural that cannabinoids will be coming out of vats from different products like algae and not grown in soil from a plant, there may be some great benefits to it. And price may be one of them, and scale may be another. So without any more ado, I want to bring you on to listen to Ben Chiarelli and me. This is a long, in-depth conversation. I think it's a revolutionary step forward. So, Ben, we're recording now. So do me a favor. Tell me your name again and your title and your company name, please.
Absolutely. Ben Chiarelli, and I'm the founder and CEO of Cellibre. And we are a cellular agriculture company based in San Diego, California.
Let's tell people what cellular agriculture is, please. Let's start right there at the top.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So cellular agriculture is really the idea of moving any agricultural process, whether that be animal agriculture, plant-based agriculture, and moving that production into fermentation. Think beer when you think fermentation. And this has been done multiple times in the past. The biggest markets are in the pharmaceutical industry, so biological medicines, things like insulin, so therapeutic proteins, have been made using this technology, effectively engineering cells as manufacturing facilities for those medicines.
Now, you guys call it biosynthesis. Is that correct?
So biosynthesis is a natural process that happens in every single cell on the planet. It happens in you and I when we get sick or get the flu. Our body biosynthesizes medicines. It happens in roses. Valentine's Day is coming up. That beautiful smell from the roses. The rose biosynthesizes those fragrances. And what we're here to talk about today, cannabis, is actually a really interesting example of biosynthesis. What that plant does at the 30,000 foot level is it's taking water, nutrients from the soil, and sunlight and biosynthesizing over 400 chemicals simultaneously. So biosynthesis is really a technical term that basically means cells are making chemistry. Cellular agriculture is really employing biosynthesis to have cells that are industrializable, like yeast or E. coli, and have those cells biosynthesize natural products that are found in either plants or animals and somewhere else in nature.
Clarification, please. What is the difference between biosynthesis or biocellular cultivation and genetic engineering?
Sure.
Genetic modification. Or GMO.
Yeah, absolutely. So genetic engineering or GMO is really the process of reprogramming the physical world. So if we want to take a step back and think about what are cells, they're really the world's most elegant and beautiful manufacturing technology. Every cell on the planet has machines inside them, and those machines are instructed by a cell's DNA code to turn nutrients into stuff. And genetic engineering is basically the ability that we have now to first sequence those cells, sequence that DNA to give us a blueprint of exactly what's going on within those cells. And then from that blueprint, engineer those cells to do really amazing things. So swap out those machines for new ones and rewrite that DNA code to employ those cells to be sustainable manufacturing facilities at scale. Biosynthesis, or what we do in cellular agriculture, is after you've engineered those cells, they then biosynthesize those molecules. So in our case, we have simple microbes that eat sugar water, and because we put new machinery in and rewrite their DNA code, they are able to convert that sugar water completely inside the cell in completely natural ways into the products of interest, in our case, CBD, THC, and other cannabinoid derivatives.
So are you genetically engineering cannabinoids?
No. Cannabinoids are chemicals, and chemicals by definition do not have DNA. They're just chemicals. What we are genetically engineering, or what we are engineering in general, is the manufacturing facility. We are treating that cell like a manufacturing facility, and we're reworking that manufacturing facility to make the products that we care about. So from a factual and scientific level, no, we're not genetically engineering cannabinoids, and we're actually making the same natural products. Now, from a labeling perspective and from a consumer perspective, that answer could be quite different, and quite honestly, it could be quite different depending on your geography.
It's quite tricky, isn't it? Really?
Yeah.
And let's talk about that a little bit. Okay, so let's step back a little bit. So you make cannabinoids. Are you making them from yeast, sugar? What's your base thing? Algae? You tell me.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. So we at Cellibre actually do not use yeast, and yeast is defined by most people as something called Saccharomyces cerevisiae. For people who are not scientists, think brewer's yeast or baker's yeast. That is the typical kind of workhorse cell that has been used in biotech for 30 years. The other workhorse cell that is used quite often is, believe it or not, E. coli. Of the two, E. coli has had many, many more products made in that cell. It's a great cell for industrial production, but it has some limitations here with cannabinoids. And there are a couple of groups that are working in algae as well. Algae is actually a fantastic cell for making cannabinoids because it obviously has some of the same machinery that you would find in a plant. The folks working in algae are the old biofuels guys from back in the day that were trying to make algae make a ton of lipids so that you could then take those lipids and use them as fuel in your cars or in your planes or in your buses. So have a really good skill set around turning those algae facilities into manufacturing facilities for other products. The reason that people use those 3 cells really starts with the baseline of that's what they're comfortable with. Those cells are well understood. We have tools available to work in them and engineer them. And if you've ever worked in molecular biology or worked in this science, you have more than likely worked in E. coli or yeast or both. So forever, we've tried to bang those square pegs into a round hole. At Cellibre, we were actually founded out of a company called Synthetic Genomics here in La Jolla, California, that was founded by Dr. Craig Venter, the man who sequenced the first human genome back in the late 90s, early 2000s, and another famous scientist, Dr. Ham Smith, who won a little thing called the Nobel Prize back in 1976. Yep. And we have always kind of taken a fundamentally different approach to this science. And instead of saying we're going to bang these square pegs into a round hole and make yeast and E. coli make the product of interest, we flip that on its head and we say, what are we trying to make? If we're trying to make CBD, is there a cell in nature that already makes a lot of the things we need, the ingredients we need to make CBD, and can we industrialize that cell? And that may seem obvious, but it's kind of like trying to take someone who's been trained up to repair the Ford F-150 truck, and as soon as they're done with their schooling, taking them to the airport and saying, hey, the 757 is down. Can you please fix the engine, right? Both engines, both similar kind of jobs, but totally different experience and skill set required to do that. So, one of those situations, better to be lucky than good. I happen to work with some of the best folks in the world and now have them as partners at Cellibre and working in what we call these non-traditional organisms. And we believe that cannabinoid production is better suited in these organisms versus the traditional hosts that people would be engineering.
So the ones you're working with are what?
Oh, come on. I can't say that publicly before we have our IP filed. We're working in cells that are microbes. They're industrializable, but we don't discuss those. Actually, our current investors don't even know the cells that we're working in yet because we don't have that IP filed and all worked out yet.
So let me just explain to listeners what I understand to be the case, why you can call these things natural, in some cases even organic, because what you're doing is actually taking the excretion of the cell and turning that somehow into a cannabinoid. And forgive me, I'm clearly not a scientist. I understand a little bit about organic chemistry, but not very much. The waste product from a cell is considered organic because it is a waste product. Do I have that correct?
Well, first of all, don't poo-poo yourself. You're much smarter than you give yourself credit for. I've listened to the podcast many times, my friend.
Oh, you flatterer, you silly flatterer. You know that's going to work really well.
So, of course it works. I've listened to the podcast many times. So the way to think about it is we are not doing – so when you think about what synthetic cannabinoids are, right? Those are chemical processes where people are mixing together chemicals and doing chemical reactions to try and make the same product or a similar product. A lot of times what you find is synthetic cannabinoids that are found on the street like spice and other things. Those are actually not the same molecules.
No, those are horrible things. Those are the terrible things. We're
terrible
not
things
about that
right?
at all. Let us not confuse matters here. We're talking about bioengineered or biosynthetic.
Yeah. So effectively, just an important distinction because people use the term biosynthesis and they automatically, their minds go to synthetic. What we're really doing is, again, you kind of have to take yourself back to what is the manufacturing facility here? And the manufacturing facility are these little cells. So it's the same thing in cannabis. Cannabis has little cells, and those little cells make over 400 chemicals. What we're doing is we're taking that machinery from one cell, the cannabis plant, and we're plopping it into a different cell, a yeast cell as an example is what some people use. And the cell is doing all the work. So the only thing we're feeding that cell is a carbon source, typically glucose. And then the cell converts all of that into CBD, secretes the CBD into the broth, and then we are just taking the broth and refining it. So the way I like to describe it is same natural product, just a different cell factory. And to the point on labeling, it's pretty consistent that you can use fermentation in the way that we are, if you're not doing any chemical alterations, using chemistry to do alterations to your final products, and you can get a natural label there. Actually, Jim, who you had on the podcast a couple of times, wrote a very nice piece on vanilla extract that everybody should read that explains this concept. And you can get organic labels if you feed the right feedstocks. So if you feed organic sugar and you start with an organic input, you can, in fact, if you do the process the right way, get an organic label on this as well.
But what you're basically, though, is taking let me be as crude as I can, like the poo of fermentation. That gets the organic label because it is coming from an organic source. Is that, crudely accurate?
Yeah, your cell is converting an organic source into a new product with no chemical intermediaries or processing. You're effectively getting that CBD straight from the poop, as you call it. We call it the broth or the soup.
Of course you do. Of course you do.
Yeah.
You're a very eloquent spokesperson on this topic. I just want to tell people that you were talking about Jim Plamondon, who has been on our podcast a couple of times, and the article he wrote about was vanilla versus vanillin. And I'll just take a step back there because vanilla, the actual production of vanilla, is a very expensive thing. You have to cultivate these pods from trees that are only grown in, 6 places in far off places. And it's torturous labor. The farmers make nothing and the consumer spends a fortune. And in the 1970s, I think, McCormick created something called vanillin, which is a biosynthetic vanilla, which is why our stores are stocked with vanilla, many of which say organic or natural on them. And they cost $3 for 2, 3, 4, 5 ounces. They don't cost anything, basically. So that is the paradigm which we're talking about today with cannabinoids, correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And there's actually, so the vanilla in that was originally discovered is actually artificial vanilla. So that's made via a chemical process. And it's really one molecule that is, in essence, capturing what vanilla is supposed to be with one chemical. There are, however, companies that are using our process of cellular agriculture to do the same thing, and they are getting those natural labels. The company that comes to mind is Evolva. It's a company out of the UK, I think Germany, that is actually commercially producing vanilla in the same way that we would produce cannabinoids, and again, are getting those natural labelings.
Now, you're going to get a lot of people upset when this stuff comes to market. Look, let's face it, the entire culture of cannabis is based on plants growing out of the ground in the soil.
Yeah. So there are a couple ways to look at this. First and foremost, here's a controversial statement for you because these are always fun on the podcast.
Please bring it on.
I think the cannabis consumer today is largely irrelevant a decade from now. And the culture is important, and what is going on in the culture is very important today. But if we think about what the plant really is, it's an intoxicant and it's an anti-inflammatory. And the product sets here are massive. I actually think a lot of the Wall Street analysts and a lot of the people that are analyzing the sector, you see very, very big numbers, and I think those very, very big numbers are actually underestimated. When you start thinking about things like cosmetics, as an example, we talked to a Fortune 25 company that has a cosmetics arm, and they told us they actually have found cannabinoid formulations that tighten the skin. Think about how big Botox is alone, right?
Whoa,
That's one example of just many that we've come across. So what I would say is, if you're thinking about the cannabis space as what the market is today and kind of the traditional culture, you're missing out on what I think is ultimately going to be the bigger market in the end run. That's not to diminish the current culture. That's not to diminish the plant in any way, shape, or form. I think the plant is fascinating. We're doing a ton of work on the plant here, actually, from a genetic perspective, just to understand it. And I think those markets will always exist. So if you think about our technology, there are really areas that we can play where the plant might play, but honestly is suboptimal. So everything that is pharmaceutically driven, we make cannabinoids the same way these traditional medicines are made. So the FDA is comfortable with this production methodology, the consistency and quality that you're going to get from our production method versus extractions from a plant that make 400 chemicals are just going to be better suited for regulated therapeutics. That's true not only for human health, but also for animal health. And I think the animal health industry is an area of cannabis and cannabinoids that is not talked about enough and is very, very interesting, both on the therapeutic side, but also on the pet food side. So we talked to one of the 5 largest pet food producers in the world, and they already have cannabinoid formulations, for instance, for older cats and dogs with arthritic conditions or inflammation problems. So again, a very, very interesting market, very large scale. And by the way, dogs metabolize cannabinoids in very different ways than humans, and some of them can be poisonous. So the specificity of your product and the cannabinoids that you're putting into those products for animals is really, really important. So I would say first, there are just markets that fundamentally I think this technology will be really well suited for, and I think we're not going to step on anybody's toes there.
You're
the other
talking
piece
about,
that I would Yeah, go ahead.
No. Well, I just want to interrupt for a second. You're talking about using these biosynthetic cannabinoids in things like pills, right? Sort of the way we get vitamins today. Am I getting that right?
One of the many ways. Well, first of all, let's take a step back. Get that biosynthetic cannabinoids out of your mouth.
All right. What do you want me to call this?
They're just cannabinoids. We're making the same exact thing that comes from the plant. So we're talking about making our cannabinoids in pills, sure, but they're also patches. They're also cosmetics. If you think about what is CBD, people say, oh, here's my CBD and it's in an oil. Yeah. That's not CBD. CBD is a white powder. So you can start thinking about formulating this into almost any form factor. What I'm saying is the ultimate end market that those go into, regulated therapeutics for humans or animals or animal health markets, I don't think necessarily are going to have the kind of visceral reaction to it not coming from a plant and not knowing where the plant source is that, say, the traditional kind of cannabis consumer might have a negative reaction to. The other piece,
I keep interrupting you. No, tell me the other piece, then I'll come back and interrupt you. Go on.
Yeah, so the other piece is the consumer markets. And, the analogy I always use is, people love a great wine or a craft beer, but there are also a lot of people in the country that drink Bud Light and eat Twinkies, right? So I think there are...
Sadly, yes. Yeah. Okay. I don't know if they need more encouragement to do those things, by the way, but go on.
Well, you've clearly never had a deep fried Twinkie, my friend. Deliciousness.
I've never forgotten it.
Yeah. So on the consumer
still in my arteries,
side,
wedging its way through my body very slowly.
There you go. So on the consumer side, I absolutely think there are product categories where this will make a lot of sense. And remember, what we're making is the isolate form of these things. But the ultimate goal is to deconstruct the plant into its individual components and allow product companies to scale. So when we talk to companies, I would first and foremost tell you that the companies that we talk to are primarily not cannabis companies. They're larger kind of Fortune 500 companies that already have products ready to go. They're ready to launch them. But their issue is they say, look, Ben, Nikki, Spiro, Scott, when we launch a product, it's not into 4 dispensaries in Michigan. It's into every CVS, Walgreens, and grocery store in the world. And if our Coca-Cola isn't the same in Australia as it is in the UK, as it is in Louisiana, we have a problem. We have a lawsuit problem. We have a consistency problem. And when you add on to this the idea of cannabis really being a product of experience, that consistency and experience becomes very, very important for the large multinational corporations. So they are really looking for production methods that will allow them to be consistent at scale. I will also tell you that the large cannabis producers, and we've talked to all of them, if you meet them behind closed doors, they will tell you that this plant is a disaster to scale. It is very inconsistent, not only plant to plant, but within the same plant. And there are things like mold and pathogens, heavy metals, pesticides. There are just a bunch of things that make this plant in particular a very, very difficult one to scale. It doesn't mean, by the way, that it can't be done. One of the arguments that you had with Jim, and I think Narbe from Canopy Rivers was talking a little bit about kind of the emerging economies and the US-Canadian markets. All of that stuff can actually be solved for. The way we're doing it today is going to take forever, and we can unpack the plant stuff a little bit if you'd like to. We actually work with the guy who set up the Genome Center at one of the largest agricultural companies in the world, and we work very closely with him. You can solve for things like disease resistant and terpene profiles and cannabinoid profiles in the plant. It just takes some time. And then you need a lot of resources to scale those to the scale that matters. So what I would say is there's always going to be kind of this craft beer market in cannabis that is very driven by the culture, very driven by the plant, very driven by the origins of those materials. But there's also a very massive market that ultimately cares about getting a consistent product into a variety of form factors. And that's really where we play in.
Understood. I want to ask you, here's what I want to ask you now.
Yep.
Thank you for saying that. Vitamins. So you look in the store and there's a million products of fish oil. Like there's so many products of fish oil that you can't believe that there are that many fish in the sea, especially not cod oil. Are those synthesized? Where are those vitamins coming from?
It's almost like we talked before this, even though we really didn't talk about any of these topics and questions. So it just so happens our CSO, Nikki Kayata, and Spiros, our CTO, developed the platform for DHA, which is one half of fish oil. Fish oil, the two main components in those nutritional lipids are DHA and EPA. Yeah. DHA, believe it or not, that you see in milk and you see in vitamins and you see everywhere else, almost none of it comes from fish anymore. We actually developed at Synthetic Genomics, our prior life, the platform that the large ingredient company Archer's Daniel Midland uses for all of their DHA production in 100,000 liter fermentation tanks. And by the way, it makes a lot of sense. That fish oil, that DHA, isn't natural to the fish. It didn't get to the fish, by accident. The fish eat the algae, and then it gets bioconcentrated up as larger fish eat smaller fish until you have enough concentrated within the fish that you can extract it. So it's a great example of not only how consumers don't even know that their fish oil is not coming from fish, right? Number one. And number two, it's just a much better way to produce this stuff, both from a consistency perspective and from a sustainability perspective. I mean, do we really need to get our DHA, if it's the same exact DHA, by killing millions and millions of fish every year and extracting the oil? Or are we better just fermenting it in the middle of nowhere?
I'm just thinking of my friends who are, and I'm somewhat like this, very organically driven, who, buy certain kinds of vitamins that are all organically produced. And if I say to them, the stuff you're taking, where do you think it comes from? It comes from 100,000 liter industrial steel tank in some part of California. They're going to look at me and say, you're out of your mind. But am I correct or incorrect?
For some products, you're absolutely correct.
For most vitamins, where are they coming from? I lot of them can't imagine they're coming from nature. It just seems impossible.
No, it is, and it's not scalable, right? And it's just not sustainable to be taking all of these things from quote unquote these natural sources. It's much more logical to take it into a production facility that is much more consistent and much more sustainable.
Now I got to go back and ask you about something else you said, which is that in order to ensure consistency, obviously we want some sort of pharma grade isolate. Now that word isolate has a very bad word. It's like a very bad word in the world of cannabis today because everybody in cannabis likes the entourage, the combination of the symphonic combination of terpenes, cannabinoids, flavonoids, all the other components, those 465 components you mentioned. Where do you stand on this? Where do you stand on the entourage effect?
Yeah, let's be controversial.
Are you anti-entourage effect?
I'm not anti anything, sir. I would never be anti anything. I'm a firm believer that.
Thank you for calling me sir. By the way, that's so unnecessary, Ben. But go on.
I think, and honestly, this is a philosophical point. I think being anti anything is lazy. I think you should always try and be for something because when you're for something, it forces you to be okay with the unintended consequences thereof. So, I'm very much for science and very much for studying these molecules. Statistically and scientifically, it is impossible for the entourage effect to be the be-all, end-all secret potion. If you think about it, what you're really saying, if you say the entourage effect and you need all of these chemicals together and that is the secret sauce to healing and efficacy, what you're effectively saying is that if I took 400 glass jars and I filled them with different chemicals and I let 5 different people mix them into 5 different concoctions, each one of those would be the magic potion. Because that's what the plant's doing. It's making 400 chemicals at varying concentrations from plant to plant, from grow to grow, and even within the leaves of the same plant. The more likely result is actually, going back to Jim's example of vanilla, it's likely not 400 chemicals, it's likely not an isolate, it's likely a handful of chemicals working in concert. And in the pharmaceutical industry, we know this as combination therapies. So 2 therapeutic agents that we put together and they're synergistic with one another to cause greater efficacy. Our viewpoint is nobody knows. And to say that we know what these compounds do or how they work in concert yet is crazy town. We have some good evidence that there's some interesting stuff going on between them. But the reality is we have no idea. And until we can isolate them and scale them, we just don't know. So for instance, there was a recent discovery on the Ps. So THCP being much more potent.
30 times more receptor affinity, right, than any other THC known molecule in mice, right?
Yeah, it's exactly right. And actually, it's
only the mice know for sure, I think.
Yeah, but it's absolutely true. It'll be true in humans too, and it's just the structure of that molecule versus the THC molecule. 100% will be more potent than will THC. We didn't even know that existed a year ago. Right?
Yeah.
And now we find something that's 30 times more potent, meaning if it's 30 times less accessible within the plant, it might still be just as efficacious as THC or causing the effects that THC does. So the entourage effect, as people have been describing it and been talking about it as being this kind of holy grail of a symphony of wonderfulness, is likely just nonsense. But it's probably true, and I don't know for sure, but if you asked me to bet my life on it, I would say it's absolutely true that there are cannabinoids that work in concert. So for us, we will be producing isolate, but we won't be just producing CBD. We're going to be deconstructing the plant into all of its components. And for us, we're focused on cannabinoids because those are the bioactive ingredients. So if you think about your favorite cultivar, you have an OG Kush that you really, really like. You don't necessarily want to take it in a combustible flower form. You'd rather have it in a vape. We can actually take a look at the phenotype, meaning the chemical composition of that flower, and we can mimic it at scale, make the same exact chemical composition at scale. So while we'd be starting in isolate, our real view is that to be able to access all of the markets, we need to be able to produce all of those cannabinoids. And where it gets more interesting for me from a consumer perspective is when you start taking those cannabinoids and actually mixing them with different terpenes that are not found in the plant, different flavonoids that are not found in the plant, where you might get very interesting efficacy from those combinations. But also, not everybody likes to smoke pine trees. There's going to be a massive market out there that likes these different flavonoids that go along with their experience. And being able to isolate these compounds at scale will open up those types of markets as well.
It does make the mind trip, doesn't it, when you think of all these possibilities, these amazing possibilities? Because we don't really even know how cannabinoids interact with other supplements, for example, do we? We don't know if you mix vitamin C and cannabinoids, there's a greater bioavailability. We don't know how these things work. I mean, the one that keeps coming to my mind is this thing called THCV, which is in your state, California. One breeder, Doug, has this one brand called Doug's Varin, right? It's a very expensive cannabis product. Are you familiar with it?
I am familiar with it. We love those guys. They're absolutely wonderful.
And it's supposed to be an appetite suppressant, right? So here you have a cannabinoid that might actually help you get skinny. Talk about skinny bitch. I mean, here you've got skinny weed, right? That's going to be a good seller, I think, somewhere along the line, if that in fact proves to be the case. And are you I mean, tell me what's your experience with THCV, for example?
Well, honestly, we don't have any.
Okay.
And I think I think you're highlighting a broader issue in cannabis. And that is when you walk into these conferences or you hear people talk, they make claims about this, that, and the other. It cures cancer all the way to it makes you skinny, all the way to it'll make you sleep better. And the reality is, while the plant has been studied pretty heavily, there is a difference between a study in a publication and a placebo-controlled double-blind study that actually proves that something is causal, right? There are so many variables in life where you live, everything else, where this evidence is sometimes really hard to read through. And the reality is we're just scratching the surface. We only really know definitively a couple of areas where cannabis is absolutely, without a doubt, the evidence is there, the data is there, and no one can really refute it. We're just at the early days of figuring out what these molecules actually do. And the sky really is the limit. And the reason that I say that is because what it's touching is the endocannabinoid system, which impacts every single function in the body in some way, shape, or form, either directly or indirectly. So, for us, it's not only finding out about all of these amazing things that could potentially come from the plant and from cannabinoids, but it's also ensuring, are there things that we don't know that could potentially be bad? Are there things that could be the other way and go to the negative side? And can we isolate those out of any products that ultimately get scaled?
You listen to Jim talk about growing amazing cannabis in Thailand, Thai stick, in the way that people have grown it for thousands of years. How does that butt up against what you're working on? Because he has some fairly critical things to say about you guys and what you're doing. He also points out that you are going to disrupt this market like nobody's business, right? The minute your stuff comes online, which is what, 3 to 5 years? 5 years? How long is it before your stuff?
Yeah, I mean, so we will have cells that can make cannabinoids at economic levels that can compete or beat the plant sometime in, call it, the next 18 to 24 months. We will internally. I think it's probably 18 to 36 to 48 months for other folks to come on board as well. We actually think there's one, maybe two companies that are a little bit ahead of us. But that does not mean that the market immediately gets impacted by this. Scaling this technology is much more substantial than people actually give it credit for. So, for instance, once we have our cell ready, we will run that cell for up to a year in 1,000-liter or 2,000-liter fermentation tanks to test conditions in production before we move up to 6,000-liter fermentation or 10,000-liter fermentation. So there's actually 3 to 5 years of scale up and optimization on process before you ever really go commercial, in a big way where you're going to be able to impact supply chains. So the science, and when we kind of have the fundamental biology worked out, that time frame is very different than when do you actually scale
get to market.
Back to the Jim thing, and kind of his thinking around Thailand and Thai stick and kind of these agricultural havens that are in tropical areas or in desert areas, kind of where the plant originated and kind of how we compete with that. What I would say is we're just going after a fundamentally different product set. We're going after a fundamentally different consumer set, and I actually think we augment it. Where we slot in for brands is where brands are trying to put products into different form factors that are not flower and scale consistent experiences. That's where we slot in. And whether that's animal health, human health, or consumer markets, we're kind of indifferent because we're making the same thing for all of them. So the more the merrier. As it relates to cannabis, I would say that the agricultural side of cannabis is very immature. For instance, the cannabis genomes that have been published to date are not right. We don't even understand, and I say we, I mean the broader community. We at Cellibre actually do understand it because we're partnered with the guy who now has the reference genome for cannabis. So we until now really didn't even understand the genetics of cannabis to understand how it grows and what we're going to be able to do with it. So Jim brings up a lot of good points around cost of labor, around the plant being in an environment where it's natural to produce it versus in a greenhouse in Canada, for instance. But where I would take you from a plant perspective is actually to the wine industry. If you think about the wine industry, it was dominated for a long time by Italy and France because they had these beautiful grapes and beautiful climates. But who wins that battle today? It's Northern California, and it's not even close. And it's Northern California growing the same exact grapes. Those cab grapes and the plants that are grown in NorCal are the same ones that are grown in France. And the quality of California wine has come a tremendously long way. And that's due to, number one, California having great grow conditions for that wine. But it also has to do with the United States being willing to use technology to breed, to monitor, to harvest those plants, and really on the production side, honing in like nowhere else in the world. And another really good way to think about this, and another good analog, is Argentinian wine. Argentinian wine is the same cab grapes that are in France, the same cab grapes that are in Northern California. And they said, we have a lower cost of labor and it's easy to grow this stuff here. And we're just going to flood the market with cheap cab and we're going to rule the day. How much Argentinian wine are people drinking? A little bit, but it was no way the disruptive force that the Argentinians thought it was going to be. And that's because the quality just wasn't that good. And it has to do with soil. It has to do with environment. It also has to do with processing and kind of how you optimize these things. So if you think about cannabis, one of the things that is not done in cannabis today is what's called molecular breeding. And this is not GMO. What molecular breeding basically means is I can take a DNA sequence of all of my plants and I can understand genetically what's going on with them and then use that genetic information to cross strains to make novel cultivars, for instance, around disease resistance. So disease resistance, I think, was one of the things that Jim hit on, that we have major problems in North America with disease resistance. 100% the case. Sure. And the reason that is because we've taken effectively cherry. If you go to the Phylos Galaxy, have you ever been to Phylos Bioscience website?
Yeah, it's too complicated for me, but it's fantastic.
Well, look for the Galaxy. And if you take a look at the Galaxy and you just type in CHERR, you will see that page light up. And it's because all of these different cultivars are connected genetically to cherry. North America has effectively taken cherry and inbred it into perpetuity to get all of these different kind of strains, cultivars, phenotypes, really THC production heavier.
Cherry, you're talking about cherry like sour cherry tree? Is that what you're talking about?
Oh. Cherry as in the cannabis strain, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And it comes to the cannabis strain. Forgive me.
Yeah. So if you think about where that was done, it was done indoors, right? A lot of times, for a long time, because of the black market and people didn't want to get arrested. Yeah. But when you do that indoors and you inbreed into perpetuity, those resistance genes fall off because the plant doesn't need the resistance genes anymore because it's not out there in nature and you're doing it indoors and you're inbreeding. So those genes fall off. In literally 2 growth cycles, we could put those genes back in. And disease resistance would no longer be an issue in North America. This is the same for terpene profile. It's the same for cannabinoid profile. So there is no reason to think that the right climates in North America or in the EU or in the developed world with the right soil could not, and by the way, absolutely will breed these plants to have the right experience, the right flavor profiles, the right terpene profiles, et cetera, et cetera. It can absolutely be done and will be done.
That's pretty fascinating. So it feels like we've gone from, or we're about to go from the days of putting things in the ground and hoping to really being able to pick and choose and almost design cannabinoids in various ratios or in various quantities and in various plants, which is, or just in various agricultural, what do you call them? Cellular agricultural processes, which is pretty amazing. If I'm getting it right, if I'm thinking about it right, it's going to move from about 1850 to 2025 in the next 5 years. Is that about right?
Yeah, and actually, the rest of agriculture already does this. So, my favorite scientific company, to be controversial, is Monsanto.
Oh,
now, Monsanto is what happens when you let scientists do marketing. You end up a bumper sticker in a bad way.
But then you get really bad things. I mean, you get these terrible things that are just killing the soil, and that they own the patents to. It's a disgrace.
Are you ready? Are you ready to learn? Here's a little fun fact, and this is for all your friends who like organic. Organic foods use just as many, if not more, pesticides than GMO crops. And actually, the pesticides that they use are more harmful for the ecosystems in a lot of cases. Believe it or not.
They're not using Miracle Grow, or what's that other horrible? What's that weed killer that destroys everything? What's it called?
Roundup. Is what you're talking about. Yep.
Yeah, that's not on organic plants. I mean, that's killing us.
No, actually, the science says a little bit differently than that. But what I'm saying is the organic pesticides that are used on organic crops, because organic crops absolutely use pesticides, are actually worse for the soil and the ecosystems in a lot of cases versus those traditional kind of pesticides and fertilizers have been.
Ben, I just have a hard time believing that science is helping the ecology of the planet, given what has gone on in the last 50 to 60 years. I really don't see it. And I don't think it's a marketing issue. I think it's a poison issue. I mean, I just have to say this. These industrial things that are just destroying the land and destroying the earth, this is not coming from nature. This is coming from perhaps very well-intentioned scientists, much like nuclear bombs. That's what scares me, is that nobody sees the future, and they couldn't. And now we're all stuck with it. And it's just killing us. Look at what's going on the earth. You think I'm being a hysterical organic person here?
No, you're not being hysterical at all. What I'm saying is that people, the logical conclusion and the logical connection is that if I'm using something organic, it is by definition better for me. What I'm
perhaps less harmful, perhaps. Maybe not necessarily
and what I'm telling
better.
you is the science doesn't necessarily bear that out.
Yeah, but I don't know how much I can trust science anymore. Look at where we've gotten to in terms of ecology and the environment. Look at what's happened thanks to science, because those scientists can't see the future. They're human beings. And then when you get corporations driving the world like this, what's the end result? Rivers that you can't drink water from?
So I'll tell you the end result.
I'm just crazy about this.
Yeah,
Go on.
No.
I just don't want you to be a part of that if you are. It's like I'm not opposed to inexpensive cannabinoids. I really think it's a great idea, because $60 for a bottle of CBD seems stupid to me when it comes from hemp. It just seems like outrage on another level. So if you can produce this stuff and it gives us the same, beneficial effects, great. But if you're going to produce it and then 30 years down the line, there's all these unforeseen consequences because science has led the way, I get nervous.
Yeah, absolutely. Come on. So yeah, let me address a couple of points there. Number one, I'm from a town called Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Been there.
And way back when, if you went to Kaufman's downtown, which was a department store that used to exist, and you parked your car and you went into Kaufman's for a couple of hours, you would come back out and you would have a half-inch of soot on your car.
That's exactly right.
Today, Pittsburgh is beautiful, totally cleaned up. And that's not because science and innovation doesn't recognize that the way we were doing things needed to change, right? So Monsanto is viewed, to get back to the Monsanto example, Monsanto is viewed really in one light, and that's Roundup Ready, which has been proven, by the way, not to do the things that people claim it does. But let's assume that it does do terrible things. It doesn't, but let's assume that it does do terrible things. That's one of many, many things that Monsanto did as a company. For instance, they do a lot of things that have nothing to do with GMO. They do a lot of this kind of breeding of plants to give them advantage traits out in the fields and out in the in the real world. And they do a lot of things to, for instance, help with soil health. So one of the things we worked with them on in the past was actually microbes. So are you familiar with the microbiome?
In my stomach?
The human microbiome?
The one in my stomach? Or is there another one that I'm...
The human microbiome. So in your gut, you have a bunch of microbes.
Yes.
And those microbes, probiotics, right, are something that help get you healthy bacteria.
Yes.
Plants are the same way. Plants have a microbiome in the soil. It's a collection of microbes that really lead to that plant's health, the soil's health, and ultimately the ecosystem's health. Right? And the brains of the plant are in the roots. So you could argue that it's actually more important for plants to have a healthy microbiome than it is humans. One of the things we worked on with Monsanto in the past was actually these microbiome environments and making them more healthy and ensuring that we augmented that soil to keep those microbiomes and those ecosystems healthy. You never hear about many of these things because everybody yells about Roundup Ready. And what I'm saying is, don't lump all science into one bumper sticker. There's some really, really interesting things going on. I'll give you another example. There's a company called Intrexon that owns a brand called Arctic Apple. And this is the debate I have when I pick my kid up from preschool with all the moms here in Southern California, which also love organic food and everything all natural. The Arctic apple, they found one enzyme that they popped out of that apple that allows that apple not to turn brown as quickly. So it can last in slices up to a week without browning. And they said, well, we don't want GMO. And I said, well, how do you feel about food waste then? How many times have your kids come home from school and not eaten their apples because you had brown apples and kids just won't eat them? And they said, all the time. And I said, so you're okay with just throwing that away? And it gets you thinking, right, that I think we're now coming full bore with the science. And quite frankly, I think social media, podcasts like yours, this ability for anybody to have a voice has really shifted the conversation at these large organizations and these large scientific organizations to one of, we have to be better. We have to be better not only for our bottom line, for our planet, because ultimately our bottom line is going to be driven for that. And coronavirus is a great example, my friend. Do you know how many biotech companies right now are working on a cure and a vaccine for coronavirus?
I have no idea, but they better hurry up.
There are 9
hurry up,
that I know of. Yeah, there are 9 that I know of. Do you know how much profit they're going to make from that?
No, probably not
0.
much. Yeah, I don't think
0.
much.
They'll lose money probably, but they realize it's the right thing to do for their brand because now everybody has a voice. And I think you're seeing a big transition now into the way people think about the world. And what I would say is always be skeptical. I love your skepticism and I love the pushback, but also don't let your bias kind of blind reading the data and actually understanding kind of where things have gotten in the last 20, 25 years, because you said this about 20 minutes ago. It's a really exciting, crazy time to be alive.
No, I agree. And I'm not, look, I am skeptical. Of course, I would be stupid if I wasn't skeptical. It's basically what you learn as a journalist. But tell me something else. What's your background?
Sure.
I need to give the listeners a little context here because I don't think you're coming from the plants. You're not coming from a farmer background growing up in Pittsburgh. So tell me your background.
Well, I grew up on 30 acres of land, and actually my cousin, Alio Chiarelli, a little shout out, was the vice president of the Future Farmers of America.
Excellent.
And put himself through school via agriculture, both animal and plant. So it was around it quite a bit. My uncle had a 175-acre farm outside of Pittsburgh growing up. But I'm actually the son of an immigrant. My father came off a boat from Italy when he was 5 years old. He was the youngest of 4. And we ended up in Pittsburgh because my grandfather, it was a very diversely white city of Eastern and Western European folks that moved there during the steel mill days. And that's kind of where my family settled. I was good at math and science, so I went and got a degree in engineering, hated it, was also terrible at it. So for the safety of society, I figured you should probably stop designing things that could potentially hurt people and go get an MBA and do algebra for a living. So I went and got my MBA at Carnegie Mellon, and then I went to Wall Street actually and worked on Wall Street for almost a decade, mainly in life sciences, healthcare technology, and broader technologies in the health space. Did about $20 billion worth of deals before I got a phone call from one of my clients to try and join the executive team where we were really trying to solve for the opioid epidemic. And that's what kind of brought me full back to cannabis. Actually, our chief clinical officer at that company did her first paper on cannabis and pain management. And the more I learned about cannabis, this is another thing that we do, this will be controversial as well. The cannabis industry poo-poos opioids quite a bit. And it's because they're in the headlines, and what's happening in this country and others is devastating. But the reality of the science is opioids are fabulous medicine. The issue isn't the medicine. The issue is the prescribing and the administration thereof. And we're giving opioids to everybody and their mother for every single condition where ibuprofen isn't helpful. But the reality is there are people with very, very chronic pain it's debilitating, and opiates are the only things that are going to be able to help. Where cannabis really kind of comes in there, and the reason that I kind of got brought full circle back to this is cannabis fills a void in the gray zone where ibuprofen doesn't work, but your pain isn't severe enough where you need an opioid. And that is a big chunk
zone.
of the pain
big zone
market. Yeah. So again, this goes back to my concept of not being don't be anti-opioids. Say what they're good for and say what the problems are in administrating them. We don't need to be anti-opioids to say cannabis and cannabinoids are a better path forward for some patients. They absolutely are. And it doesn't have to be at the detriment of anything else. Just tell your story, right? So that is really, that work there, really got me interested in the entire pain management space. And then I ended up getting introduced to Dr. Venter here in town in San Diego, Craig, and saw a bunch of his properties and ended up joining his executive team at Synthetic Genomics prior to founding Cellibre. And that's really how I got involved in this idea of using biology as a manufacturing technology.
First of all, I'm really happy you're happy to be controversial and provocative. I got to thank you because so many people are afraid of that. So I'm really happy about that. I thank you. So you think it's about 5 years till you're in market?
No, we'll be in market well before that. So it'll be, I would say it's probably more like 3 years, give or take, until we're in the market. But in the market for us is really in the market for us is scale. And we should talk a little bit about what this technology ultimately means, right? Going back to your idea of sustainability and good for the earth. What would take you a 5 million square foot grow operation in Canada, our technology can do in less than 30,000 square feet. And square footage is a really good proxy for resource usage more broadly, right? Sorry, were you going to say something?
No, I'm thinking about lights. I'm thinking about ventilation. I'm thinking about all of those really big, noisy machines that take to power a grow. I mean, most people, I don't know if they've ever been in grows, but they're incredibly energy-sucking places.
Yep, and arable land is being used, right? So arable land that we could give back to the planet is being used to grow the plant. So that's a really good proxy for kind of resource usage. And there was actually a study done in 2016 around energy usage in cannabis in the United States. And what they found was the cannabis industry in 2016 used over $6 billion of energy. To put that in perspective, the entire pharmaceutical industry used a little over $1 billion of energy.
I think they said it was some like 2% of the entire Texas grid, right?
That's right.
Some enormous amount of energy.
And we're not even legal yet, right? So we're not even scaling this to what the ultimate market will be. So, from our perspective, that's something that's very, very important to kind of be thinking about is this idea of how do we shift not only cannabis, but quite frankly, every industry into a more footprint light, sustainability centric means of production in the long term.
I'm feeling square tomatoes come again. I'm feeling them come up. But listen, I want to ask you, are you the end of the hemp industry? Like before the thing even gets started? Because
not at all.
Why would anybody go to the problem and the hassle of growing hemp and then extracting it to make CBD? Go on.
Yeah. So are you ready for a little surprise? Nothing that the hemp industry is calling hemp is actually hemp. It's all cannabis.
It's all cannabis. I'm not so surprised.
So it's all cannabis that is bred to turn off that THC machine, which is why you find that hemp coming in hot, producing a lot of THC, right? Yeah. So first of all, traditional hemp does not make a lot of cannabinoid, which is the reason right now nobody's growing that traditional hemp because the market is the CBD market. That's where you get the most value. The reality is CBD is going to come down, and there's actually a really smart guy, James Stevens from Sokatai, which is a hemp company. James is an absolute rock star, and he and I have talked about this quite a bit because he used to be in our world of engineering microbes to make sustainable products. And in our world, a lot of times what happens is the product of interest is not where you make your money. You don't make your money off of the CBD. You make your money off of the ancillary byproducts that then get made from that. So where the hemp industry ultimately is going to focus, I think, is in things like building materials, textiles, paper, plastics. Yeah. They're going to make all of their money from that, and CBD will just be a way to get them to break even quickly. I think you have to think about the plant in a more holistic fashion in the long run. CBD really isn't going to matter to their bottom line as far as I'm concerned when you start thinking about it in the long run.
Understood. Ben, are you a user? Do you use cannabis?
I am not a user. I actually do not even drink alcohol. My only vice is caffeine. I drink about 8 to 12 cups of coffee a day. And I actually did that when I had my kids. I wanted to be constantly present and never off the ball at all when I have my two boys. And for me, that's the kind of lifestyle that I have chosen post having those kiddos. So no, I'm not.
Okay, listen, this has been, I'm hoping, the beginning of many conversations. I'm sure we'll get people really upset, and they'll have a lot of complaints, and I hope they call them in, and then we can have you maybe talk to them one-on-one, or have some sort of a live podcast where you can talk about more about what you're doing. I think what you're doing is fascinating. Of course, I'm skeptical. I wish you luck. I hope you do it really well. I hope you create medicines that are effective for people at a very low cost. And, disrupt the pharmaceutical industry if you can.
Yeah.
Or at least sell out to them, which you may want.
Yeah, for us, it's all about consistency, but it's all about access as well. And I think your point on access is one that people often miss, is that we have an amazing plant and amazing cannabinoids here that are very, very expensive, which limits the number of people that they can.
No, I'm well aware of it. I think it's sinful right now, but I think it will change. I want to thank you again, Ben Chiarelli, CEO of Cellibre. Thanks again, Ben.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Listeners, you can join the conversation with Brave New Weed today by visiting us on any of our social media platforms. Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, all at Brave New Weed, will bring you to a place where you can like, comment, share the show, interact with other listeners, and keep the conversation going. Together, we are the world of Brave New Weed.
Matthew, now that you've heard Ben talk about this unbelievable, almost unimaginable future, right, that is probably going to kill the hemp CBD industry as we know it, and certainly his idea of eradicating stoner culture as the dominant force in cannabis, very interesting, I think. What's your response?
Well, I definitely see how this is a threat to hemp production for CBD. Obviously, we all know that is an environmentally heavy lift and a complicated process. You have to grow a ton of hemp to get not a lot of output in the oil situation in that regard. I think it's just coming, and it speaks to a bigger conversation that we are starting to have as a society, which is when it comes to things like selective growing and selective breeding and genetic modification, and whether these things are created in a lab or grown outside, we're going to have to decide here where we choose to draw our lines, right? We're already seeing meat grown in labs that has been deemed safe to eat. We've been doing this with like vanilla extract forever.
As Ben noted, as we talked about on this podcast.
Vitamins and minerals that can just be synthesized out of other, products, out of other plant materials, all these things. It's like, is that science a scary science fiction, or is this just the natural course that we're going to have to take? Obviously, food is a big point of contention. We cannot support making enough food, creating enough food in a sustainable way to get everybody to live on this planet. So we have to know that these things that are, lab grown meats or, tomato plants that have been selectively grown to be more productive. It's the same processes, just now being applied to cannabis as the science goes on. So, there's a lot of questions that people will have to ask themselves about what they're personally okay with. But as long as the science is there to back it up and the processes are safe, I think that there's no way you can't expect that this is coming down the pipe.
Well, my only concern, as I mentioned to Ben, is that scientists are not oracles. And a lot of scientists, what they say today is not the same as what they see tomorrow. Okay, we see atomic energy, we see nuclear bombs as the prime example, right? The inventors of this technology have had huge regrets, moral, ethical, philosophical, their entire lives. That is my concern. And
weaponized
I am really happy, by the way, to begin this conversation on this podcast, because I want to keep continuing it. I want to have debates. I want to bring in opposing points of view. There's a lot of things that Ben brought up that I'm just not educated enough to be able to rebut or refute at this point. But please, listeners, chime in, send us notes. Where can they send us notes?
Anyone who wants to contact the show, you can write to us at bravenewweedcast@gmail.com. Any comments we get there, and we'd love to respond. You can also go to patreon.com/bravenewweed and leave comments on episodes there, or just bravenewweed.com to access any of our social media websites. We love getting comments on Facebook. We love getting tweets and posts on our Instagram. So sound off. We check all that stuff, and you will be heard, and we want to hear from you.
Excellent.
I'm curious about that, though, Joe. If you could, and let's speak perfectly hypothetically here, if the ultimate fear is a weaponized version of synthetic cannabis, what does that look like? Are we talking about like a stoner bomb?
No, that's funny. It wasn't exactly what I was thinking. I was thinking about more what are the effects of these cannabinoids grown in labs that we can't identify today, that they tell us are safe.
Sure.
You know, and we've been through this with drugs and pharmaceuticals, and I'm not asking for enormous regulatory oversight and imposition here. I am just, these are technologies that, I mean, again, scientists like Ben will say this has been going on forever. And in fact, you know, the fact that your vitamin, the fish oil you take in your vitamins has been synthesized like this for, I don't know, 20, 30 years, leads me to think that probably it's quite safe, and that all of my organic using and you know, espousing friends are okay with it. But I don't know if they know, and I don't know if this conversation has ever been held quite so widely and publicly. And here we are at the birth of a new industry. We have all of this vast new communication technology out there. I want to make it, you know, one of our pillars that we talk about this stuff in great depth before it takes us by surprise. That's it. That's all I can say right now. I need to learn more.
It's a real good question. If on a molecular level, the chemical is exactly the same, does it matter if it came from cannabis or from algae?
Philosophical question of the day. Again, I want to thank the Summit 420 for sponsoring this podcast. Summit 420 is the best cannabis conference that I've ever attended. It's part of the YPO network. It's happening in San Francisco, California on April 24th and 25th. I will be hosting that event. There are going to be amazing speakers. I'm giving you drips and drabs as we continue this sponsorship series, and I will be announcing more as the weeks come up. Please be sure to register soon. Go to www.ypo.org/Summit 420 2020. It's a lot of 20s in there. Summit 420 2020. Bring your spouse, bring your partner, bring any cannabis curious folks you know who are in the YPO org. Thanks again, YPO.
Also, listeners, don't forget, if you want to take advantage of that 50% off sale going on at Sunsoil, you can visit sunsoil.com and shop their wide range of oils, gels, soft capsules, topicals, all of that, which will be on sale through the month of February at a staggering 50% off. So go check them out.
Matthew, thank you for joining me. I look forward to talking to you in the near future. Listeners, thanks for tuning in. Be sure to share this podcast widely with everybody you know. Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to the Brave New Weed podcast. This episode and all future episodes are made possible by amazing listeners like yourself. If you like what you've heard, we encourage you to show your support by giving $1 a month for special access and rewards on patreon.com/bravenewweed. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram via @bravenewweed. Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/bravenewweed. And remember, you can always find more information about us or information discussed in each episode by pointing your favorite browser to bravenewweed.com.